My name's Tom Johnson, and I'm really excited about moderating this panel. And I'm excited because when you think about what happened here and look back 5 years ago, the parties that are sitting up here were at serious odds. They were involved in some serious litigation, both civil and criminal. That was begun by the Ramsey County Attorney's Office under John Choi and Stephanie over at the other end. Tim O'Malley was very involved initially, and then once Archbishop Hebda got on the scene, he was involved as well. But it went from litigation that lawyers on the street thought this is going to last for years. This may be up in the Supreme Court before this gets resolved, but it got resolved. And it was resolved through a 24-page settlement agreement that is multifaceted. It's in its totality, it's a roadmap for the Archdiocese moving forward. Two of the provisions in this very, I would say, creative, sort of out-of-the-box agreement by some lawyers who knew what they were doing, and includes John Choi and Stephanie Wiersma and Tom Ring from the Ramsey County Attorney's Office, who's not here, and Joe Dixon, who was representing the Archdiocese in the litigation, and of course, Tim O'Malley and the Archbishop. But they, rather than staying the course as lawyers, the kind of determined type A, we've got to get this resolved through this lawsuit here. There'll be a winner and there'll be a loser, and we're going to be the winner. Well, they found a way for both sides to win. And within the context of this 24-page agreement, there's two provisions that relate to restorative justice. And those are the provisions that we're going to focus on today. Before, however, we do that, I'm curious to know from each of you, just what did you know about restorative justice, and what had been your experience when you entered the negotiating, or came to the negotiating table, that made you think that, hey, we should put something into this agreement that requires the Archdiocese to do something about restorative justice? John, you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to start. So I've had a really privileged career to. Before I was the county attorney, I was also the St. Paul city attorney, and it was during that time period where I became acclimated to kind of what restorative justice is all about, and more importantly, what it could actually accomplish. So as a city attorney, we did a number of things that would replace the traditional criminal justice system with restorative justice approaches, and oftentimes it's very difficult to exactly put into words what is restorative justice, because I think it can mean a lot of different things in very different contexts. But at the end of the day, what it does provide, I think, is really a better outcome. And that's something in law school that we don't talk about enough, is outcomes. And the outcome that we want is justice. And for many of us who practice in the area of juvenile justice, criminal justice, we don't oftentimes take the moment to stop that assembly line and just reflect on the system that we operate in. Nobody actually that currently works in the system today created that system. In fact, we inherited it from a long time ago. But we presume and assume that somehow that is the way in which we achieve justice and we get better outcomes for the people that are involved. Oftentimes there's a victim, there's an offender, but also too for the community, because when the prosecutor initiates a criminal complaint, they do it not on behalf of the victim, but actually on behalf of our community. So we have that process, and the vast majority of everything goes through something like that when there has been harm done where a law has been violated. But there are other ways in which we can achieve justice and get better outcomes. And so restorative justice is one of them, and it's an area that I've been very involved with as a St. Paul city attorney, and then also just now, very, very recently, as we're thinking about thinking about a different way to achieve justice in the juvenile context, that we're recognizing that sometimes better outcomes can happen when we think outside the box. And so that was my orientation and understanding of it, and recognizing that the adversarial process in which I found myself with the Archdiocese could only accomplish so much. I mean, we were very creative to utilize the civil child protection statute and the criminal statute together in tandem, working together. And so we came to some resolutions on the civil side. But on the criminal side, quite frankly, if we had continued to proceed, we'd still be litigating right now. I would be convinced that we would have gotten a conviction, and then that conviction would have been appealed, and then it would have just kept being appealed. And at the end of the day, let's just say that we did resolve it, and the state's interest won in that particular case. At the end of the day, it was a misdemeanor offense. And again, we were prosecuting the corporation, and there's reasons why we chose to do that. It helped us get to some of the systemic change that we wanted to see. But at the end of the day, a conviction against a misdemeanor corporation would have resulted in nobody goes to jail, even though under our law, corporations are people, but you don't put a corporation in jail, right? And so what it would have been in some term of probation, something along those lines, a fine, and for the most part, that would have been it. And no opportunities to think about some of the broader things that the current civil settlement has allowed to take place. But most importantly, as a part of the second revision of that settlement agreement, in lieu of us dropping the criminal charges, restorative justice can only start and can only begin when there's acknowledgement by the offender that wrong has been committed. And in that, as a part of that process, Archbishop Hebda said out loud and very publicly that they had failed children, that they had put the interests of the institution themselves above the interests of protecting children. And so from there, we can start a process by which we can restore people. It's been great for me to see the journey that the victim's family that were victimized by Curtis Waymeyer and the Archdiocese in terms of their journey into reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think it's helped them in many ways. And then, of course, it wasn't just that family that was victimized. It was the Catholic faithful who put their trust in our institution and were told back in 2002 when the Dallas Charter was put together that everything was fine, and it wasn't. And then the parishioners, faithful, our community, and I would say priests, the clergy, are victims as well, many of whom, the vast majority, never ever could do anything wrong. They're human beings, but I mean, I'm talking about running afoul of criminal laws. They're victims too. And so, as a part of all of this, I felt it was really critical to incorporate concepts of restorative justice to ensure that the head of our archdiocese, our archbishop too, was participating in that. And today, I mean, I think the provisions of the agreement said only like at least three, but quite frankly, Archbishop Hebda and many of the people that have been involved have gone far, far beyond.
John, we'll get to this.
Yeah,
We'll get to
okay.
this. Archbishop, what did you know about restorative justice when you were at the negotiating table?
Tom, I'm embarrassed to tell you, I knew almost nothing. I had at one point when I was in the Bishop of Gaylord, I had a couple approach me about engaging in a restorative justice process, nothing to do with abuse of minors or anything like that. I'd done a little bit of internet search, but I didn't pursue that at all. And so really, I knew little about restorative justice, but was intrigued by what Mr. Choi was able to describe about his experience. I was very grateful to Hank Shea here at the university, who was speaking to us a little bit about that as we were considering what were our options, and very grateful then for the introduction that came to Justice Geske, who definitely put flesh on the bones, on the skeleton of restorative justice. So even though I knew little about it when it was first suggested, I was intrigued by it, and as I was learning more about it, I became more and more committed. So that's where I was, Tom.
Okay, good. Tim?
I was in a similar boat. My recollection is that the idea of this concept and including it came from John Choi. Shortly after that, we knew about Hank's work and Father Dan's work, and they introduced us to Janine Geske, and we learned a lot more about it. But really, at that point, my world was centered on some of the legal issues, clearly, but then also how to address some of the brutal past, some of the things that happened. We were investigating those, we were dealing with those, we were working with victim survivors to try and sort some of that out, and then also how to deal with harm moving forward. Looking back on it, exactly what we're trying to do fits with restorative justice, but I didn't have that concept in mind. I do think it fits with, as was mentioned earlier today, some of the foundations of the Catholic faith and other faiths, of all the things you've heard from the other panels. That does fit together, but it wasn't a concept that I had in mind at all at the beginning.
Stephanie, any familiarity on your part with restorative justice when it appears as though John suggested it?
I joined the I Knew Very Little club.
But you agreed with your boss.
I did. I did what my boss told me to do, like a good employee. He deserves all the credit for the restorative justice in the settlement agreement, but I did come from a background of community organizing and working with communities to overcome problems, so I understood the concepts of restorative justice, and I understood what we were trying to achieve in the settlement agreement. I think what Gene Bishop said about an eye for an eye not being sufficient went to what we were doing, and the aspirational goal that's listed at the top of our settlement agreement is that no child would ever be the victim of child sexual abuse ever again. And to do that, we had to do more than just have criminal justice in the terms of probation or an $18,000 fine.
So the two provisions that are in the agreement, one calls for a day-long conference for restorative justice and healing, and reconciliation, day-long conference for restorative justice and reconciliation. And the other provision calls for, requires the Archbishop to conduct mutually agreed-upon restorative justice sessions. And I want to get this question will evolve into a longer discussion, but I'm just curious, when you struck those words and added them to the agreement, did you have any, mutually agreed upon restorative justice sessions? What were you thinking about that might look like? Who wants to take that on first? John, you probably put those words out there.
Might be, at least on the conference.
Yeah, I mean, the conference, we're going to plan that now, and part of it's changed over time. I think we had, like Stephanie mentioned, there's an aspirational goal here, and it's 24 pages long. There's a lot that we put in there that we continue to interpret ourselves, to be honest. But the conference will happen. It's going to be very much victim survivor focused, and it's coming up soon. There'll be another conference that we're going to host here, this Archdiocese, in April, that will have hundreds of people here from around the country, and that'll be more on lessons learned, which is part of what we talked about making that, but we've kind of split it into two. But your first question about or the mention of restorative justice sessions, at least from my perspective, I was a little bit new to this, and what we wanted to do was set the stage for us to prove to each other, or at least give the Archdiocese the opportunity to prove to the county attorney and others our sincerity and our efforts to correct some wrongs, but also to do it in a way that it was measurable in somehow. And we said, okay, we'll do this restorative justice thing. Well, rather than just say, all right, we'll do it, I think it even says you'll do a certain number within a certain period of time. So it was very specific. And as John mentioned, we kept working at that, a lot of people between the two offices, and then that evolved into a much more of a practice that got played out in a lot of ways that we might get to this afternoon or not, I don't know. But
Archbishop, I know that you've pretty much set aside Friday afternoons to be available to victim survivors if there are any that want to come to visit with you. is this part of what you consider to be the language or implementation of the language in the agreement? And then maybe talk about how those sessions are going.
Yes, thank you. So I think initially when I still had a little bit of a lawyer's hat on, and when I was hearing about
The Archbishop is a graduate of Columbia Law School.
when I was hearing about the 3 sessions that we had committed ourselves to, I was thinking in a much more formal way about facilitated sessions. And we had engaged a professor from the University of Minnesota who was able to help us with those. But as we engaged in that process and as we came to know more about restorative justice, it certainly has extended beyond those facilitated sessions to those opportunities to have discussions, to have conversations. And initially we had said that, I had said that from February through April, that I would leave Fridays open, Friday afternoons open for that. And we had a good number of people who were themselves survivors who would come in to speak. That wasn't the first time that I had encountered survivors, nor was it the last. We've had people who've been asking since then, so we try to always honor that time. But it's a little bit what Gene Bishop was saying today, that somehow or another when you know the stories, that's what changes everything. And so whether it be in the facilitated restorative justice session or in those opportunities to have somebody share their experience, and then to have the opportunity not only for me to listen but also for me to express, that somehow or another that takes the whole matter to another level. Because it's not just statistics, it's not just something that I've read about, but it's somebody that I've shared an experience with. That I know their stories. We can cry together. We can get angry together, and that has really changed the whole way in which we've been able to address not only the immediate difficulties that were before us, but also as we try to plan for moving forward beyond the time that the settlement agreement binds us. So those encounters, and I feel so blessed by the number of people who have stepped forward to have those discussions with me. Those encounters have really, I think, had a lasting impact on the way in which our archdiocese will be approaching these matters in the future, how it is that we are able to improve what we're doing, and how most especially that our own outreach to those who are survivors, those who have been hurt, will be improved or enriched, and giving, I think, all of us an opportunity for greater healing.
I think all of the panelists here have had an opportunity to sit down with a victim survivor and to hear their story. And from that story, you very quickly realize just how deep the hurt, the harm is, and how trust devastating it is. And it's, to that extent, it's unique, where you've got not just an interpersonal trust that's violated, but you have when that trust is violated, someone's faith can also be violated, and that's really elevating what's happening here to a very unique and different level. Based on your experiences, what is your level of confidence that restorative justice will work with victim survivors of clerical sexual abuse, given the depth of the harm, the uniqueness of the harm, and maybe you can comment on that.
So I think one thing that's really important for people to understand is that we would never ever force a victim to be a part of the restorative justice session, nor would we ever have restorative justice in the context where the offender is not at a place where they're recognizing the harm that they have caused. So a big part of, so if we're talking about a very narrow, specific example of how a restorative justice session could work, oftentimes we'll think about it in the person who was directly harmed and an offender. So for instance, in the case that we were involved with, it would be someone like Curtis Waymeyer and the family that was involved. I don't think that necessarily that could possibly take place right now, but maybe it could, I don't know. And that's not necessarily what this is about, Tom. I think it's important for people to also understand that it goes beyond that, that victims are not just the persons that are directly impacted or the family, but it can also include an entire parish that was harmed. Think about the parish in which the context of this abuse occurred. There was tremendous harm that was done. So we need to restore that. Trust was broken, right? It can also be in the context of broader populations as well. And so I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to believe that restorative justice happens in that very kind of compact way. It can be a very broad way. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish is recognizing that these types of processes can bring healing to victims. So let's go back to this very singular compact example. It can bring healing for those victims who have been directly impacted. It can bring healing for
The
those
example we're talking
communities.
about now is the Curtis Waymeyer.
Right, but it could also be that entire parish or whatever it might be. And then also, too, it allows for opportunities for the person who did the wrong to atone for those things, and that means so much for victims, and it's also an opportunity for people. See, restorative justice is a lot about listening more than it is about, and it eliminates any type of power differential. And in getting into that type of process, we're really focused on trying to undo that harm, address those harms that have been caused, and help the people heal and come out of that in a better way, a more productive way.
Archbishop, Tim, have comments on about, and the question really relates to the depth of the harm that's done and your confidence level that there is a role for restorative justice to play, and taking into account what John just said, that there's different levels,
Yes.
different types, groups of victims here.
I wish I could say that after somebody that we have a restorative justice session, that a person is healed. And I'm always so grateful for Justice Geske, who talks about it's an ING process, right? That it's something that continues into the future. But it's been my experience that even those encounters, and when they go deep, that they open up the possibility of further healing. And we whether it be in terms of a person's relationship to the church, that's often I can't speak to restorative justice in other situations, but often for somebody just to have the opportunity to speak to a representative of the church and to share their story allows them to at least begin to test the waters about their own faith or about going back to church, for example. Just one little story. There was a gentleman who shared with me, and he really had not faced much of the abuse that had happened in his own life, and he was waking up in the middle of the night screaming. A married man, adult children, and his wife was obviously a little bit concerned because it was something that repeated itself, and he found himself in therapy, and that was very helpful for him, and that was when he first began to talk, and the therapist helped him to speak with his wife. But it wasn't until he was able to talk to a representative of the church that the screaming stopped. Now, I mean, for whatever reason that's there, and by no means was that the end of the process. But in terms of it being a step, I think that's the kind of story that gives us some hope that what we're doing is worthwhile. One of the things that's been amazing for me is that there have been so many people who, when they've come forward to tell their story, also commit themselves to wanting to somehow or another improve what the church does, make sure that kids aren't going to be hurt, make sure that we do a better job with outreach. And Tim could speak about the specifics there. But it's phenomenal, the generosity that comes from the hearts of those who have been hurt by the church and who are survivors of that, who then become more engaged in assisting. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be practicing Catholics. That's not the aim right there. But in terms of being willing to engage with the church in improving the situation, that's been phenomenal.
Tom, I think the more profound the harm, the greater the good that can come out of restorative justice. Point one. Point two, I think, is that it's inaccurate, in fact, it's stupid to stereotype and categorize victim survivors. What's the remedy? We talk about what could happen out of this. Stephanie talked about, yeah, you could have got a misdemeanor conviction, and where would we be? What would actually help somebody and individualize it? And I'll give you an example. Well, first, maybe just a quick hypothetical. Imagine you go away for the weekend, right? And you fly back on Sunday night, you're walking up to your house, you're pulling your suitcase, you're mumbling about the lack of legroom on the airline, and you get up to the door and you go down, lock the door, and the light's out. And you think, geez, I bought one of those 10-year bulbs. They burn out. This is stupid. You go in, you walk in, you find out you've been burglarized. The house is trashed. You will never be the same again. And there's people that would talk about that being very profoundly harmful to them, that somebody came in their home. They felt invaded. They felt all that kind of stuff. I guarantee you, you will never approach the house the same again. And through no fault of your own. You're going to walk up, you're maybe walk around the house and see if the window's kicked out. You're going to notice if a light is out. You're going to notice those things. Now apply that analysis to sexual abuse of a child and the harm that can result from that. So what's the remedy? You know, we talk about restitution. Maybe you get $10,000 from your insurance company to take care of the jewelry that was taken and the electronics. Or maybe the deterrence effect. Maybe neighbors are more aware, and there's actually a good thing about it. Neighbors feel bad, they're victims in the community, but they're more aware, so maybe they're actually safer today. But what about for a person who was sexually abused and the harm that results from that? And here's the example I'll give you. We had a gentleman, and it's in part from the work of John and Stephanie, and then also Mike Finnegan in Anderson's office. We have a standing offer to any victim survivors that if they want to meet with us, you know, we'll examine their case. And for the lawyers in the room, in the bankruptcy, if you filed a proof of claim, which has all the information on it, there's a protective order. We cannot even acknowledge that that exists. We would violate the law if we did that. So we can't act on that. So we said, if you want to come in and talk to us, we'll examine it and we'll try to do whatever we can to make it right by you. I don't know what that'll be, but we'll do something. So there's a gentleman, he's 78 years old. And he came to us through his attorney, and he met with us, and he told us what happened. It was well over 60 years ago that he was abused. By everybody in this room, I think, would look at him externally and objectively and say he's very successful. He's happily married. This is an unusual one. He's happily married. Just that's unusual. He's happily married. He's got a couple wonderful kids. He's one of the richest guys I've ever met in my life. He's from out of state. He flew in here on his own plane to meet with us. Okay, so money's not an issue, all that kind of stuff. We meet with him, and he tells us what's going on. The priest's name has not been disclosed at this point. So we said, well, here's what I promise you. I will listen to you, we'll investigate it, and we'll do what we can, and I'll get back to you. Thank you. We investigated, we determined that, yeah, this is a substantiated claim under the standards we've established. So about 2 months later, we call him and say, I want you to know that today we're going to put this priest's name up there. Okay? He's going to go up on our website. We owe it to tell you that before it goes up. I know you don't look at our website a lot, but just so you're aware of it.
Is the priest still alive?
The priest is dead. He doesn't do this to punish the priest. The priest is dead. If you believe in an afterlife, he's maybe being punished, right? He didn't need the money. He's got money for counseling. He does all those other kinds of things. But he starts crying on the phone. And he says, I just have to tell you that after 65 years, and he didn't tell anybody for 30, 40 years, whatever, he said, after all that time, for me to know that somebody in authority in the church listened, didn't automatically believe, but investigated, and then believed me. He said, this is the most peace I've felt in 60-some years. And very importantly, not only did you nod and say the right things, which a good actor can do, you actually acted on it. You put the son of a bitch's name up on the website. Thank you. Thank you. Now, that's an individualized remedy for that guy that cannot come in any other way. And I think that's a form of restorative justice. It's not passing the the talking stick, which I've done with the Archbishop, with victim survivors. He acted as the surrogate. I'm mad at the church. You know, a number of victim survivors, I say you can't categorize them. A number of them aren't necessarily mad at the actual abuser. They realize there's an illness, whatever it might be. But how could the church have let this happen? You know, how could that have happened? So they wanted a bishop to sit there and look him in the eye and talk to him. So those things can all, but there's a wide range of what can be embraced by restorative justice and how it can actually help people in some of the worst situations in their life.
Thank you. Let's go back to the two provisions, which were quite specific. A day-long conference, restorative justice sessions over a 2-year period. I think it would be valuable to, and so they were specific. You are in planning of the conference. There's been sessions, so that sounds all pretty good under the agreement. But there certainly are many indications that this has gone, and in fact, I know that it's gone further than those two provisions. And maybe it would be useful for you to talk, Archbishop and Tim, about how that's evolved, and then for Stephanie and John to respond to what you know is going on or have heard now is going on, and whether that's something that you had in mind at the time the agreement was signed, or are just, happy that it's happened. You want to start, Archbishop?
Yes, and I'll leave the details to Tim. But when we went into some of those difficult negotiating sessions with Mr. Choi and his team, we had in the forefront of our intention to be able to correct situations that had existed in the past, and really to try to do better. So we wanted to be able to resolve the matters at hand, both criminal and civil. But we also knew that wasn't enough, that we needed to be willing to do whatever it took to change the institution locally in a way that would both show our commitment to change, but then also actually help the situation. So we were hoping, as we went into negotiation, that if we would show that we were willing to go beyond what we thought that the Ramsey County Attorney's Office would require from us, that would establish grounds for good faith, and that we would be able to talk to one another in that way. But so it wasn't something that was extracted from us, but rather it was a desire to collaborate in a way that would make our system better, that would make children more safe, and that would begin that process of bringing justice as well. But that was the mindset, at least, of those who were negotiating on the part of the Archdiocese. And Tim can give you some details of how we had already begun some of those processes before that.
Yeah, we had, I think if there's one difference maker, and I'll try to tie this in, Tom, I think it does, is the, and John Choi, I can recall us having discussions in smaller groups than the mediation and the groups when we got together in bigger groups about what is our real goal here, and it was to affect an institution, to hopefully change a culture for the better. There was a certain secretiveness, certainly, maybe clericalism you hear, an arrogance. How is it that this could have happened in an institution that's any religion? How could this happen? How could people turn a blind eye to it? So we started thinking about how can you change the culture, and I think the one difference maker between years ago and today is the role of laity. Just the role of laity. Not that clergy is important, it's very important, but the partnerships that are developing. And that's going to be the movement that was talked about. That's where it's going to come from, not from an archbishop or one or two other people saying, we mean this. It's going to be a movement. It's going to take hold. And I think that the restorative justice efforts that were going on, meeting with people, developing those relationships, we formed some committees, we've done a lot of different things to try and spread that, if you will. But the Royal Lady, from the very beginning, when you even think of it, when the bankruptcy, the criminal, and the civil were resolved, there was really a core group of 6 people that were there that night until whatever it was, at the law firm until midnight or so. We're in our separate rooms, we're coming in. There were 6 people in the archdiocese room. There was the archbishop and then 5 lay people. There was Brian Short and Tom Abood and Karen Roundhorst, 3 members from the board. Those are the Catholics. That's the church. And that's a different image than people had from the archbishop can do no wrong from 20, 40, 60, 1,800 years ago, right? I mean, there's a role there, but it's the partnership. It's the having different minds around the table rather than all like-minded people just kind of going, yeah, this will be good. We'll pray and it's all going to be fine. No, we need certain expertise. And I think having laity involved at the seminary and restorative justice, in some of the outreach programs, in his one-on-ones. When he meets with victims, often Janelle Rasmussen from our office meets too, so that there's a safety to it. And which, as an aside, I heard this one time at one of our parish meetings. You know what went wrong? One of the people got up, there wasn't a mother in the room. That's a pretty telling comment, really. It wasn't, I mean, not, but well, Janelle's a mother, and she's in the room.
And we hired her.
Yeah, we did, yeah. And she's teaching at the seminary. She is part, when I tell people this in other areas of the country, they're kind of stunned. She is not only teaching at the seminary now, she's part of the formation committee to decide if men who are in there are moving forward from year to year and should progress to be priests. It used to be all collars, and that wasn't that long ago. And again, they add a lot to it, but you know, they're going to leave the seminary, they're going to go in the real world. We have to prepare them for that. So I think the role of laity was the emphasis, and I think there is a lot that can still continue from that.
Stephanie, does what's happening add up for you? I know you've spent quite a bit of time monitoring the agreement and more recently looking at whether or not the changes that have occurred are resulting in culture change within the institution. I mean, where do you come down on this?
Yes, I think the Archdiocese deserves a lot of credit for going above and beyond what was outlined in our settlement agreement. I think that we all knew at the time that we drafted it that it was the floor, that we hoped and we thought that the Archdiocese would take it farther than what we outlined in the agreement. I think that whenever we talk about how this came about and what happened and what different ways it could have gone, everyone in the room can acknowledge that if the right people had not been at that table, this would not have happened. And so when we were looking at what do we put into this agreement, we looked at our aspirations and what we were hoping to achieve. We looked at what was best practice, what were other places doing, other organizations, the Catholic Church itself. How could we hold the Catholic Church to its own standards? And then we had to have some sort of confidence that they would take what was put on paper and run with it, and they have, as Tim laid out for everyone. They've done so much more than 3 restorative justice sessions. I know that Justice Geske going to Assumption tomorrow for a session, if anyone wants to join. And have really, and I think you've heard too that they've really taken on restorative justice in many different forms. It's not just 3 listening sessions where folks can come and hear about what happened. You can sit down with the Archbishop. You can go to a session with Justice Geske. There's just many different ways you can go to talks like this. And then the role of the victim coordinator as well. There's an acknowledgement that one person's restoration and healing is not the same for the next person's. As we go out and we do talk to people about the impact that this has had and whether or not there's been a change, there's a divide as to whether or not people feel that restorative justice is the answer. And so I think the Archdiocese is open to hearing that, and they're not just putting all their faith into the restorative justice aspect.
John, anything to add?
No, I think that was perfect, Stephanie. Thank you. That was really, but I think that I had an opportunity to participate in one particular session at a parish at St. Odelia, which is one of the larger Catholic parishes in my jurisdiction in Shoreview, and Father Dan Griffith was a big part of that, and Justice Geske. But I have post that session, I know lots of people that go to that parish and that were part of that particular event where they had an opportunity to listen to some speakers, and then they went into some discussions at their table that was kind of modeled after a restorative justice model. And people took from that, I think, some great comfort to have this intentional way that they were going to talk about these things that they had been experiencing as Catholic faithful. What people have experienced is that they felt betrayed by their institution, that their faith had been shaken in some ways, and they were very disappointed and hurt in many ways. And so there was opportunities for people to discuss that, and for people who needed to hear that, but then also for the people that were not involved directly with any of these clergy sex abuse, but just a part of the institution, to also be able to express their sadness and sorrow and recognizing that what had happened was wrong and that it shouldn't have happened, and that we're all committed to kind of wanting to have this change and making this lasting change. That type of dialogue and that time and that intentional way to talk about that as a community was really meaningful to a lot of people, and so that's a big part of it.
I'd be curious to know how well you think you're doing, First Archbishop and Tim, and sort of walking the line between affirmatively providing direction to the healing process and sort of from a kind of a top-down, here are the services that we have available, versus allowing, and encouraging things to happen organically at the parish level, or even more broadly within the community. Can you talk a little bit about, what your philosophy is on walking that line?
We Catholics are big on both and, right? And so we certainly want to do what we can, resources that we're able to bring or to stimulate thought of others. But we've been very grateful for the work that's come out of our parishes as well. We mentioned Father Dan before, and the beautiful work at Our Lady of Lourdes. That's where I first had the opportunity to hear Jean Bishop, and that was very instrumental for me. But so we recognize we had parishes that were stepping forward to be part of some testing as to how we could move forward. It took an obligation, it took a commitment of time on their part. We're very grateful for that. But our hope here in terms of the philosophy is to be able to present options, but options that also really empower our parishes to take things in where they see would be best. Obviously, it's very, very different experience from a place like St. Odelia's or a place, a little rural parish where you have 80 people in the church on a Sunday. And so for the pastor to be able to figure out how it is that we do that is significant. But it's not just even coming from our parishes, but also from other groups. We've formed a body called the Lay Advisory Board. They, for example, are very interested in this question, and I know that we'll be getting suggestions from them. We're engaging in this process of a synod in the Archdiocese. We've had so far 4 of the large prayer and listening events, and we're getting some ideas from that group as well, and I know they're going to continue to percolate. Tim could give more of the details, but where we've really been blessed has been with the collaboration of a small group of survivors who have, from the very beginning, have been invested in helping us to get this right. And so some of the ideas that might seem like they're coming from top down were actually ideas that came from them. And we're happy to be able to facilitate that, really feel blessed with the ideas that have come from that group.
Tom, I'd offer 2 practical thoughts on the role we should play in terms of driving this or collaborating or how it should be. One is short-term and one is long-term. There's 2 victim survivors in the audience here today who we have known now for 4 or 5 years. Paula and Frank, and I'm not outing them. They're known. In fact, Paula works for us now. But early on, we met, and a group of us started talking about what could we do, and we had these great ideas. And I remember we even planned a couple events, and nobody showed up, right? We all dressed up for the prom, and there was no band. It was just nothing. And we thought, what are we doing wrong? Well, part of the problem was nobody trusted the Archdiocese. 3-4 years ago, we said we need to establish a certain level of credibility if people are going to be involved with us in any way. And we tried to do that through very concrete actions rather than just words. But at the beginning, we could say something, and there were ones who would call other victims and say, listen, who's behind? Is the Archdiocese? Well, they're involved. I'm not coming, period. Okay? So short term, there's that practice. Long term, this cannot be run by any one entity. We have partnered with the government. We have some nonprofits, the Zero Abuse Zero Abuse group. We're working with them on long-term solutions on plan. We need to have we need to have more than 325 people in this room. We need to have this be something that takes hold, and it is organic, and people do it, and we should play a role. We should absolutely play a role. But I think it's irresponsible for us to be. In fact, if you go back and you want to start getting to the root causes, we don't have time to do all that, maybe it's that there was an entity or a couple bishops that had too much authority and were driving too much. Maybe we don't need a dictatorship. Maybe what we need is a group of people that complement each other and work collaboratively and have a true partnership relationship, and then let it take off in that way.
Okay. Well, I was going to start questions at 2:35, but boy, do I have questions. Maybe we should get a running start on it. Well, I'll ask one of my own, because I think we've got a lot of lawyers in the audience, and even for non-lawyers, this may be of interest, which is, and they keep kind of, good for you folks. The question is what do you see as the largest challenge from a legal perspective to the successful use of restorative justice in providing healing and serving as an option for healing to victim survivors of clerical sexual abuse? So are we still dealing with legal challenges here, or have we moved beyond them? John?
So I think it's just in the context of, not in the context of the settlement agreement, but more so just
Correct.
Overall in general. So I think the biggest challenge would be is that you would never want to impose restorative justice on anyone that didn't want to do it, because there are people who have been victimized, and we would be re-victimizing them if we suggested something that the person was not ready for. And so obviously it should come from a genuine, deep desire of that person to maybe take that journey. And of course, then you have on the other side, restorative justice is of no value if the person who was the perpetrator has absolutely no ability to understand that what they have done is wrong, or any type of remorse. If it's not even possible, I think restorative justice becomes, it can't even really start. But when the conditions do exist, and I think a lot of what Gene Bishop was talking about, when your heart is open, the highest forms of justice can be achieved. Those concepts of love and mercy and the way that God intended us to be can be achieved. And so I guess it's understanding that these conditions can only exist in the right set of circumstances involving the victim and the offender, but when they do, if we have a culture and an openness as a society and as people who might be in charge of systems to allow for these things to not necessarily replace traditional systems, but maybe can act alongside of them or after them. And maybe we'll see a world, I know that in Ramsey County we're working on a world where it can replace the juvenile justice system, not in the context of sexual abuse, but in other contexts. But I think as we evolve as human beings, those things are possible. But ultimately, that's I think the biggest challenge and appropriately so, because I don't think we should ever force this on anyone.
Let me ask one of the questions as a follow-up to that, and it's, do you know if there's been any connection found between restorative justice and recidivism? Is there any research out there with findings as to whether or not it's it's helpful?
Right, so there is some data. We've been employing it. I think the Minneapolis School District has done some work, and there's a data that would show that utilizing a restorative justice type of approach would be just as good as doing any type of other response or a diversion. We're working on a big project right now in our juvenile justice system, but that's one of the things that we are going to be as we launch our project. That's the million-dollar question that we actually want to answer and actually want to prove that you don't have to accept what we inherit as a part of our traditional system, that we can design something different and actually get better outcomes around public safety and justice.
Archbishop, I have a question for you. How has hearing people's stories changed you as a person?
Yes. Can I go back just one
Sure.
question, though,
Sure.
too, in terms of legal obstacles, and then I'll get to this question, too. You know, one of the things that will no longer be relevant here, but many of you will be working or living in other dioceses that might still be addressing these things. And one of the obstacles that was very difficult for us was the bankruptcy litigation. And so I think, especially from a number of survivors who have come in since that was resolved, said we really didn't feel like we could enter into that kind of a discussion while the bankruptcy was continuing. So we have to find some way in terms of the system to be able to facilitate those kinds of discussions that the law didn't see, or the law or lawyers, and I'll let other people decide which that is, didn't allow at that time. So that would be the first thing. In terms of how I've been personally changed, I mean, I think there's just that anytime that you have an exposure to someone who's willing to share very intimate details about their lives and ways in which they've been hurt, but it so often reflects years of reflection upon an experience, and you just feel so privileged to be able to sit with them. I think that always then prompts in me that recognition of you know what each one of us carries in one way or another, and how what's on the surface isn't always what's down deep. And I think certainly in terms of leading a local church and leading a diocese, you know, just to recognize the severity of the harm that's caused by abuse in a very personal way is going to affect any decision that I would make. We've been blessed we haven't had to deal with that recently, but whether it would be in terms of returning somebody to ministry, I'm a lot more cautious now than I would have been before I started listening to people talk about how an event that took place 70 years ago continues to have a daily impact on their lives, and it's real. So I'm certainly much more conscious of that as a church leader. That might not go to the personal level, Tom, but it certainly goes to that aspect. But just always recognizing that those experiences bring to light the complexity of human life, and how things aren't always exactly what they seem, and how little decisions that we make can have such a huge impact in someone's life for good or for ill. And that's not just in terms of somebody who's physically abusing, but also the way in which a church responds to somebody who comes forward with a claim. That I'm always amazed that people can tell me the exact words that they heard when they first came forward, right? Something that's etched in their brain, and that's pretty grave.
Tim, did you have a comment?
Well, I had one comment on the earlier question about what obstacle could there be in law or lawyers. And while I agree with you can't let bankruptcy or adversarial nature of some proceedings, we've got to figure out how to still do restorative justice in that regard. And John's talk about the system not necessarily embracing restorative justice. But I talk from a broader perspective of keep in mind the role of attorneys. They're tools. That's all they are. They're not the decision makers, you know, and I'm speaking to the law students in here and attorneys and those who are going to hire attorneys. It's not a win to write the most persuasive brief or to win a motion. You know, what's your real goal here? What are you listening to your client about? And we made some decisions early on, as did John and Stephanie on both sides of this, that were very non-traditional. There was an easy path. I shouldn't say an easy path. There was a traditional path that each of these two men could take. And they showed some real wherewithal, some real leadership to not just take that. They wouldn't have been criticized. And there's a chance we'd be before the U.S. Supreme Court right now. I mean, that would have been the predictable way to go. One of the very early decisions we made, we had attorneys come in and interviewed them. And some well-known, reputable, very talented attorneys, in simplistic terms, their answer was, paper the hell out of them. You know, file motion after motion, take them out of their comfort zone. This is the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. They don't deal with bankruptcy. They don't deal with First Amendment constitutional religious issues. They don't deal with corporate law that much. They mostly charge individuals. We could fight this. We can win this. We could win this. At what loss, though? So we ended up hiring Joe Dixon, who is a very talented attorney in all those arenas. But that wasn't the goal, to win that one motion or to win that one thing. It was something that John brought up with and the whole pattern. So don't break the law and don't not listen to the advice of attorneys, but the law isn't designed to be an obstacle. There's often ways, if you open your mind to it, that you can stay within the law and still accomplish a lot of good things. And you can listen to an attorney, but it's your decision, not your attorney's decision, as to what you want to do.
And if there's any future prosecutors out there, the duty of a prosecutor is not to merely seek convictions, but is to seek justice. We are ministers of justice and to achieve positive and good outcomes for our public.
Stephanie, do you have anything to add on? So the legal challenges, I threw the question out, and then John answered it very well, and then I'm in the sea of questions here. I went on to the next question without allowing others to comment. What do you have to say?
I think it's been answered very well. I just think it's a tool in the toolbox, and you have to be willing to be creative. There's no statute that's going to prescribe it, so you have to be willing to think outside of that and think creatively within the law.
Archbishop, there's a number of questions that in one way or another relate to how are things here being affected by what might be going on in the Vatican or with the Conference of Bishops that may impact, you know, what you can do or can't do going forward. Any quick thoughts on that? And also just there was a question on just what's your responsibility or authority now vis-a-vis other dioceses, either within Minnesota or Minnesota, North and South Dakota.
Great. So we certainly have enough work just dealing with our archdiocese. Huh? So that has to be my first priority. At the same time, as part of a larger church, we realize that there's an impact on us by legislation that affects the whole world, universal legislation that would come from Rome, and then also legislation that might come from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in pretty specified areas. And so our response, my response, along with Bishop Cousins, has been both to engage the tools that are handy for us to be able to have some impact, especially with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, sharing a little bit our experiences, for example, and speaking about things that have seemed to have borne good results here. And I think that we continue to look for those opportunities on the national level. We don't have so much of an opportunity to do that internationally, but we certainly are very, I think the work that we do here in the conference does have an impact. And so as the legislation that came out from Rome in June concerning accountability measures for bishops very much reflected the presentation that was given by an American bishop speaking at a conference in February in Rome. So I think there is that opportunity to have some impact, but it's much more indirect. I'm very grateful that I have a very talented staff, and a number of people around the country have been watching what's what they have been doing, whether it would be in Tim's office or our Chancellor for Canonical Affairs, our Chancellor for Civil Affairs are here, the work that they're doing, and they're inviting them to be part of panels like this and to speak about creatively about how we as a church might be able to address these matters. So even though my focus has been very much here in the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis, you have Tim or Susan Moharan, who have been speaking in a much broader forum and who have had an impact in that way.
Some questions that might lend themselves to quick answers. Have circles among priests been considered?
Go ahead.
You were leaning.
Well, no, I didn't hear what you said exactly. Have circles what?
Circles among priests. Have the restorative justice for priests been considered?
Yes. So let me just speak. Justice Geske came a few weeks back, and we had an event just for priests. And so it was, and that, of course, is just the first step as well. It kind of modeled for how that might happen. It was a smallish, maybe 20 priests who came and took part in that. I was really pleased with that, and it was a very moving experience for the priests who were there. And Tom, as you've reflected, they've had an impact in their lives through all of this too. So it has been tried, and it considers to be something that's contemplated.
Next question with a quick answer. Has a restorative justice process been created in the Archdiocese for the healing of an entire parish? And then they cite the Weimar Parish, Blessed Sacrament.
Yeah, we've had a number of, with the Weimar victims themselves, a number of us, including the Archbishop and myself, have met with the victims and with the victim's mother in a, I wouldn't call it a formal restorative justice, but along those lines. And then we've probably held, I don't know, at least 10 that you've been at, that Justice Geske's been at, and the Archbishop and I have been probably at another 10 parishes where we've had some type of a session about the history, what's happened, where we're at, and how restorative justice plays a role in the future. So there's got to be 20, 25 parishes that have been directly requesting that, and we put together sort of a menu of options for parishes and for victim survivors to get involved if they want. It's all at their, and like the Archbishop said, we went to one in a small farming community, and we talked about that Canvas Health was available to them, that anybody who might want to talk to them, and the guy came up at the break, a couple of 78-year-old farmers, both of them, and they said, we're farmers, we don't go to counseling. I said, oh, okay, all right. We just go out and work. All right, if that's your way to do it, that's your way to do it. But we lay those options out to people. For some, something's good, something else is good, and we're just trying to give those options to address individual parishes, also depending on what's happened at their parish. Weimar is a good example. There's a couple other parishes where there were priests who were notorious, who were repeat offenders, and that has had a great effect. St. Odelia with some of the Croziers. So we addressed that very specifically at that parish.
Just on the family of the victim family at Blessed Sacrament, one of the greatest joys that I've had is to get to know that family and to see their journey around their own healing. It's not to say that it was necessarily because of any particular restorative justice session, but it was an orientation towards the fundamentals around restorative justice, and just it's been a complete joy to see just the healing that's starting and getting better, but it's never will ever be completed. But it's an orientation that can achieve those things in terms of the healing for victims.
Does the church plan to keep the restorative justice methods as part of their culture after the interaction with Mr. Choi and Stephanie Ann? I think the real key here is when the court's jurisdiction ends, which is February 1st of 2020, so it's coming up in a few months.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that one. It's yes. And we can see that. So what we're doing now is we're trying to put in the building blocks so that's going to be a long-term tool for us to address issues. And certainly we see that in this area of sexual abuse of minors by clergy or church personnel, but we see all kinds of other opportunities. And so we've had Justice Geske speak as well to our lay ecclesial ministers. So I think that makes a much broader application. We've had her speak to our staff at the Archdiocese. So it's just teaching the tools that we think will continue to serve the Archdiocese and not in terms of just the structure, but the people of the Archdiocese far beyond the termination of the settlement agreement.
So when that settlement agreement was first entered into back in December of 2015 and then amended again in the summer of 2016, so it's been in place for a really long time. And it's been a long journey of really trying to ensure that the promises that were made in the settlement agreement were fulfilled. And I can tell you that, the Archdiocese is well on their way of, doing right by every one of those promises. But the more important thing is about embedding that cultural change. And if we had to kind of focus on what is the overall theme of what we were trying to accomplish in these settlement agreements, it's really a big part of it is the engagement of lay people in the church as a part of how the Archdiocese would make decisions about clergy who had run afoul of certain policies, et cetera, and that concept I think has very much been furthered, and it's a part of these restorative justice sessions. But these are really values and principles that are developing as a part of the Archdiocese, and I have absolutely no doubt that these things are going to continue. And so as we get close to the end date for the settlement agreement, which is February of 2020, and we're working on really kind of wrapping up that work. But I think another fundamental principle is that it's at cooperation with civil authorities as well. That's very much alive and well, and so we've developed a relationship where certainly we're going to continue to work on things together, and we'll be talking about that more as we get closer to that end date for the settlement period.
A couple of quick questions, and Frank, I'll ask you to come up. One, and these are the last two, so we've got to be quick here. But we've moved through a lot of these questions, but there's still a lot here. There's a question about, was there a definition of restorative justice that people were working from? And if so, what is it? I don't think there is one in the agreement, but was there some discussion at the negotiating table about what we meant by that? Or, is it pretty much, what has been talked about throughout the day, where there's a lot of different forms it takes.
John Choi had all the leverage.
No, that's not true.
He thought it was a good idea. I didn't know a lot about it, but we embraced it at the time.
And
We've learned.
And it was a part of a journey to kind of define what that meant. There are obviously some understandings of generally what it meant, but I think it's a work in progress.
The last question is, what is the role of the clerical sexual abuse ombudsman, and is it a condition of the settlement? I am the ombudsman for clerical sexual abuse. It is a provision in the settlement agreement as well. I believe it came from John Choi. Is that right?
More Tom Ring.
Tom Ring.
Yeah.
All right, but it came,
Yeah.
and it provides for the creation of an independent person to serve as an advocate for clerical sexual abuse victims if they want to seek advice about how they're perceiving a problem and whether there is an issue with how things are being addressed, what could be done to change that, if they're seeking counseling, to help get counseling, etc. And then the last question is, and how is that going? It is one of the most rewarding things I've done in my career. The Archbishop has spoken to just how meaningful it is for him to sit down with victims, and it's hard. Many of you have done that, and so you have a sense for it. But it is really hard to grasp how emotional it is to have a person lean into you and say that I haven't told anyone. So,
Tom, can I answer that question?
yes.
So just a little bit, because you can't toot your own horn, but you've done a fabulous job of that, and just the way in which you keep my feet to the fire, and my offices as well, is I think very important. But you're always bringing your own perspective and really that interest in justice that makes all the difference. We asked, the question before was, are we having an impact beyond maybe in the Archdiocese? And at least with the diocese in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota, we've talked about, in particular, about the way in which Tom has been the ombudsman. And we recognize that it was something that was required for us, but how that's really served. So I think that that's an idea that will continue to gain traction if we can only find more Tom Johnsons. So.
Thank you. And now, Frank, would you like to come up and give us some of your thoughts on how restorative justice and other healing processes, from your perspective as a person steeped in the work of victim survivors. Frank is the president of the Minnesota chapter of SNAP and does a phenomenal job. He volunteers a lot of time.
Yes, we are. SNAP, S-N-A-P, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, although we're much broader than that in these days, we'd hope. And I want to focus a little bit on SNAP Survivors Network. Notice it doesn't say victim survivors. And I heard that earlier this morning, that in many people's minds, victims and survivors is a synonymous term. That ain't necessarily so. I will use a small example, if I might, that this happened the other day, to tell you, see if you can see the difference between a survivor and a victim. So this is from my friend, and she says, "Hey, Frank, this is, I need help. I can't believe I let my secret out." And that's what we suffer with. The crushing shame. The fact that I carried that around for 40 years. Who am I going to tell? We were trained to go to our church for help. I went to them. I got nothing. I'm going to tell my wife? How embarrassing. What am I going to stand my kids? I'm going to tell my 3 kids I let this guy do what? I could have walked away. I could have done all these things. Well, at least now from this you can tell she's about to transition from victim to survivor, right? So here's the rest of the message. I can't believe I let my secret out. It's destroyed my life. I'm shit-faced. I want to die. And that's one of the gals that I work with. It's still out there. If you think it's gone, it is not gone. So what did I listen to today and hear a little bit about? Well, restorative and justice. Restorative to me means to put back. So you're going to fix it. And I think Tim talked about that with the burglary thing. I think of that as the same type of thing. You come home, your house is burned down. They build you a new house, everything's fine. It is not fine. It's never going to be fine. So what about justice? Well, justice is treating people with respect. And Dean Vischer this morning said, in early law, we were taught, you don't talk to the victims. You get to the facts, you do the thing, but you don't talk to the victims. And that's what we ran into with the church. We were victimized originally, and almost everyone that I work with tells the same story, says, look, it was bad enough that he did that. But when I went to the church, when I went to the bishop in my diocese, they told me, they're there, everything's going to be all right, and they sent us on our way, and we were re-abused right then and there. And that was worse. So what are we trying to work on today? Well, hopefully, I talked about today about the culture, and we are the culture. We're the culture, and culture dictates our response, right? So we made the culture that allowed this to happen. We allowed this organization, and we allow, just as we are with our government, we allow these organizations to exist, and then we bemoan what they're doing, but we are those organizations, and unless we take some responsibility, and several speakers talked about that today, you better be in there. If you're not walking the walk with them, if you're not, then you can't be talking the talk either. If you haven't been to jail, then don't tell me about what it's like to be in jail. Don't tell me about sentencing, 30, 60, 90 days. Remember somebody said, nobody is asking you, anyone, of course, to go walk the victim's role. Why don't you go out and get abused and see what it's like? Can't do that. But you can listen, and that's what we wanted. And that's what we asked of our church, and it never happened. It's finally happening now. You got to think of where we were 5 years ago. Chaos. If you know anything about what's going on in the diocese, it was chaos. 3 years ago, a group of us met, had a little lunch over at the Chancery, and we said, what can we do? Where can we go? What can we put together? Can we do anything? We don't even know what restorative justice is. What are we going to do? We never really envisioned this today, but this is a product of what we did. We left that day, and I'm not even sure we had a resolution. But we had some ideas, and we had some knowledge, and we had some will. So, and I was one of the people that wanted to be a part of it. And I think Tim asked me that, what are you in it for? And I said, I'm in it to change it. I'm in it because I'm going to bitch about it. You can bet on that. You're going to hear me. You can ask the bishop. I'll complain, but I also want to be part of the solution then. And I think I speak for most of our SNAP members. So I think restorative justice demands that we be involved. I know in AA, 12 steps, right? You're not really considered to make those steps until you reach out to someone else. That's what you have to do, or you're not going to be healed. That's what they've been preaching that for years. What, 50, 100 years almost with when Bill started that organization? So the organization in this case is the church, and by reaching out to victims, we can get the job done. And I think we've started that. And that's another thing I told the bishop a long time ago. I said, you can't pray. The Catholic response is we light a candle, we make some smoke, and we ask the Holy Spirit to come down and fix what the hell we're doing. But until you get off your ass and do it yourself, it ain't going to get done. And that's what I hope that we're doing, and that's what I hope you guys will be a part of as well. So we got to walk this walk, and this process is slow. But you got to remember church years. In church years, they talk about things like, it's only 400 years since he made that statement, so we haven't really acted on it yet. So 3 years, are you kidding? We've been in the church, we've only been going on this for about a minute. That's where we are. So we're making progress. And I think this is a model that's going to be sold around the United States and around the world. I believe that. These guys will tell you, they've been to meetings, people go, what are you doing? No kidding, wow. And you talk to the enemy? That's us. Yeah, we do. That's what Jeannie Bishop talked about. You get the victim and yeah. That's the idea, and that's called healing, folks. So my message is this. We got to walk this walk together. It's important, it's possible, and it's demanded. Thank you.
Frank, thank you very much. It's one thing to get up in a healing circle, which is done in confidence, and to talk about these things. It's another thing to get up in front of a large group of people, and I salute your courage, and I thank you for it. I think there may be other victim survivors in the audience, and I hope that you took to heart Tom Johnson's role. He's independent, he can speak to you in confidence, and he's accessible for your needs. So if there are such people, please do get in contact with Tom. There's much food for thought, I think, that we've been able to share today. We hope you'll continue to stay with us if your schedule permits to join in the wine and cheese reception and continue the discussion. Tom told me there's quite a number of questions that he was not able to get to, and we'll have people available to you to answer in person, ideally. One other program note, Stephanie mentioned this, but for those of you who want to experience a healing circle, there is an opportunity tomorrow. So at Assumption Church in St. Paul, Janine Geske will be leading a restorative justice program that will include individual healing circles. And it starts at 9 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. There are plenty of other opportunities. Father Dan Griffith has been doing them on a regular basis. His new title is the Liaison for Restorative Justice here in the Archdiocese. And he'll be working with Paula Kempfer in providing all sorts of opportunities for people to do it through the months and I hope years to come. So if you go to a healing circle, I can guarantee it's something you will not ever forget. Thank you to all our speakers today. Thank you to our panel in particular here. It was a great way to end the day. And thank you for joining us.